The 80s were a magical time for arcade owners. A plethora of classics were unleashed upon the public from developers all over the world. Iconic games like Donkey Kong and Galaga. Technological marvels like Dragon's Lair and Battlezone. Adrenaline boosters like Spy Hunter and Paperboy. Despite the intense competition from companies like Atari and SNK, many would consider the king of the 80s arcades to be Sega. Their titles captivated audiences around the world to such an extent that it gave them the foothold to eventually compete with Nintendo in the home console market. Some of the most memorable arcade releases from Sega came via their superscalar technology. This technology formed the basis of several iterations of arcade hardware, leading to some of Sega's most beloved titles ever, like Hang-On, Afterburner, Outrun, and, of course, Space Harrier. Space Harrier was a revelation, mixing high-speed shooter gameplay with a 3D perspective, then layering in psychedelic sci-fi styling and what is to this day one of the catchiest theme tunes in the biz. When it hit arcades towards the end of 1985, there was nothing else quite like it. It proved extremely popular, which meant only one thing: ports. But how on earth were developers supposed to port a game designed for extremely expensive, custom-built arcade hardware to the woefully underpowered consoles and computers of the era? Without going into too much detail about the arcade original, it's fair to say that it was as striking as it was addictive. The presentation was bright and flashy, whilst the gameplay provided a classic, simple shooter experience. The unique nature of the game was delivered through the marriage of presentation, controls, and technology. The presentation was driven by the power of the arcade hardware underpinning it. Large sprites, smooth scaling, and fluid frame rates all radiated technological prowess, as did the clear voice samples and distinct instruments in the music. This was supported by a memorable art style that represented 80s Sega in the best possible way: colourful, creative, and abstract. The Harrier was controlled by an analog flight stick, regardless of which variation of the cabinet your local arcade ended up with, from the standard upright all the way up to the deluxe Body Sensation edition. This meant that there was a veritable ton of challenges for developers to overcome when trying to port Space Harrier to other systems. The speed, the sprite scrolling, most of it seemed basically impossible for consumer hardware of the era to reproduce. But forget the obvious power differences. What about the variable quality of the TVs and computer monitors of the era? Or the available controls, which were largely digital and through simple controllers or keyboards? Bringing Space Harrier home was a monumental task, with each destination having its own slew of obstacles to overcome. Happily, this is where the creativity of developers can be seen in full swing. There were so many ports of Space Harrier over the years that it's hard to keep track. Some were released relatively soon after the arcade, others came out several years later with more powerful hardware and experience behind them. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the more interesting ports over the years, and how developers packed Sega's behemoth into a take-home container. The arcade version of Space Harrier was released in late 1985, so the following couple of years saw conversions to a variety of systems. Some were consoles, some were microcomputers, but all were a massive step down from the arcade hardware technologically. The port to Sega's own home console, the Master System, was one of the first, and a good benchmark against which to measure other versions of the game. First released in 1986, it came a full year after the arcade release. The screenshots on the back of the box tell part of the story. This is a severely cut down version of the arcade game, with much of the detail in the sprites and scenery removed. The second you start the game up though, the compromises become even more obvious.
Get ready!
The game is slower, and the smooth scrolling is diminished. This doesn't just affect the presentation, there is a distinct impact on the gameplay. It feels choppier to play, but more importantly, the 3D perspective is less clear. Distances between the Harrier and other objects are far more difficult to track than in the arcade, making the already high level of difficulty even harder to deal with. Deaths often feel unfair, with enemy projectiles flickering into view and feeling completely unavoidable in the process. The soul of the game is still here, with the music and voices present, albeit in much lower fidelity. For a first attempt on a severely underpowered console, it's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. For all these flaws though, the Master System was actually one of the most capable of those receiving early ports. Other, less powerful hardware options would require true miracle ports to have any hope of retaining the spirit of the arcade. The various NEC microcomputers of the early 80s received their own ports of the game. There wasn't much going on with the hardware though, so the developer was really left to make wine out of water with these ports. A quick pause just to say, this is one of my favourite ports of all time. It's something that shouldn't exist and yet is immensely charming in its own way. If you've never seen it before, prepare yourself.
Get ready!
This footage is from the PC-88 version, though other versions of the microcomputer would also receive ports. Space Harrier simply shouldn't exist on these computers, so seeing it running at all is a trip. The visuals are bizarre, with only the Harrier and some enemies having any detail at all. Everything else is represented by differently coloured rectangles. And yet, it works! It runs really well and has a unique aesthetic that is so ugly it comes full circle back to being attractive in a weird cyberpunk-esque way. There are also lo-fi voices and a shockingly great rendition of the theme. This port just goes hard as hell. I know I sound crazy, but I'm sticking to my guns on this one. The rest of the ports during this period of time are to other computers of the era. Systems like the FM7, the Commodore 64, and the ZX Spectrum saw ports of varying quality. One of my other favourites is the Amstrad version, with its zippy gameplay, fun interpretation of the theme song, and wireframe take on the arcade version's art style. Most of these ports were huge step-backs from the arcade original though, with only the X68000 version coming close to replicating the arcade experience at home. But what would happen with a couple more years and more capable hardware for the developers to work with? The late 80s brought on a slew of additional Space Harrier ports. The destination hardware was significantly more powerful compared to the previous ports, but still nowhere near the specialised arcade internals. This led to versions that were still cut back, but at least felt closer to the original in both presentation and gameplay. The PC Engine received an excellent port of Space Harrier in 1988. The game was still cut back significantly. The checkerboard ground was replaced by simple scrolling lines, sprites were less detailed, and the game as a whole doesn't visually pop as much as the arcade. However, the game feels great to play.
Get ready!
The speed is good, the scrolling is smooth, and the theme song is on point. The whole thing feels much easier to control than earlier ports thanks to the consistent frame rate. Judging distance in 3D is less of an issue here than in earlier ports with choppier scrolling. The voices are even present. though in much lower quality than you'd remember coming out of the arcade cabinet. The PC Engine was a big hit in Japan, and games like Space Harrier were a major reason why. It was an inexpensive, accessible way to bring the arcade experience home, whilst retaining the core of what made the game so special in the first place. In other parts of the world, the Amiga was king. It was only natural then that the venerable home computer would receive its own version of Space Harrier in 1989. Known as being a multimedia powerhouse, expectations were high for a worthy conversion of Sega's classic. Thankfully, these expectations were met and, in some cases, exceeded.
Get ready.
The game looks very clean, with nicely defined sprites and detail. The perspective of the checkerboard floor warps to aid with the 3D effect, and everything moves along at a rapid pace. There is also a fun version of the theme song that sounds like a slightly slowed down chiptune remix of the original. It's definitely not the arcade, but it's an excellent representation, and a good showing for the Amiga hardware. In still shots it looked similar to the Atari ST version that had been released the previous year, but in practice, it ran much more smoothly and was a lot more fun to play as a result. One of the most unexpected ports was to the Famicom, Sega's primary console rival in the 8-bit era. Playing this again years later, it's hard to believe that this is an official release and not an unlicensed curiosity. It's also fascinating because, unlike many of the other ports that share visual and gameplay similarities with other systems, the Famicom version exists largely as its own entity.
Get ready.
The visuals are unique, and the sound effects and music have been converted to the console's unique sounding audio output. It would be easy to compare this favourably to the Master System version, and call it a day. But it's not really a fair comparison. The Master System port came out in 1986, whereas the Famicom version was released in 1989. The hardware generation was much more mature by this point, and the developers were generally more comfortable with the tools. This makes the weaknesses of the Famicom version harder to ignore. It runs smoothly enough and is reasonably playable. However, there's a lot of sprite flickering that makes it really frustrating to dodge enemy attacks compared to other ports like the Amiga or PC Engine versions. It may be the Sega fan in me, but something about the Famicom version just feels off. Even the theme song, which the logical side of me thinks has been done fairly well, sounds strange coming out of the Nintendo brick. So it's an interesting version and a decent option to be sure, but it wouldn't be my personal pick of the bunch to play Space Harrier at home. There weren't too many other ports during this era. The Atari ST and DOS ports were released around the same time, but both were similar to the Amiga version visually, whilst being significantly less smooth to play, with the DOS version being particularly poor. Otherwise, this was an era where the home gaming landscape was changing, with new consoles being released and a shift in preferences away from simple arcade gameplay for many players. The 90s brought another wave of hardware. This time though, there was power enough to deliver experiences much closer to the arcade than ever before, as well as portable versions that would have been unthinkable just a few years beforehand. The Game Gear port came out in 1991, early in the handheld's life. Like many games for the hardware, it was based on the Master System version from a few years beforehand. This meant that the highs and lows of that version also apply here, though the novelty of having the game on the go helped make the deficiencies more palatable, at least.
Get ready.
There are also some other changes to the sprite work and a rearranged soundtrack. The tricky part comes from the logistics of the Game Gear screen. It's small, making it difficult to follow the action when it heats up. The Harrier also takes up more space on the screen, making this version feel somewhat claustrophobic to play. The screen technology is fairly primitive, making the picture blurry in motion and difficult to see from any angles that aren't directly front on. This was fine for other games, but for a difficult, fast-paced game like Space Harrier, it was a death sentence. So, maybe a great glimpse into the potential of the handheld in this era, but not really a great version of Space Harrier to actually play. The 32X was intended as a stepping stone between the 16 and 32-bit generations. It was also plagued with technical issues, a financial disaster for Sega, and the cause of endless tension between members of both the American and Japanese branches of the company. Despite all of this, it managed a fantastic conversion of Space Harrier that ended up being the closest to the arcade of all of the ports up to that point.
Get ready!
The presentation was extremely similar to the original, with the bright colours, smooth scrolling, and detailed sprite work all accounted for. The sounds were also there, from the digitised speech to the otherworldly enemy sound effects. Of course, the theme song is front and centre the whole time, encouraging those with decent sound systems to crank the volume and channel those 80s arcade vibes. The issue here was less about the port, and more about the context in which it was received. People had just spent money on a next-generation upgrade to their Mega Drive. Most of them were staring down the barrel of the 3D revolution, with both the Saturn and PlayStation banking on polygons as the way of the future. The 32X was supposed to be part of that generation, so ports of 2D arcade games from almost a decade beforehand were not exactly high on wish lists. In retrospect though, Space Harrier was a great game for the system, and helped show off the strengths of the hardware, unlike other games that really only serve to highlight its weaknesses. Probably the first port to be fairly known as Arcade Perfect, the Saturn version was as brilliant as you'd expect. The console, despite the marketing focus on 3D titles, was really a 2D juggernaut, so it was able to handle the scrolling and sprite effects of Space Harrier with ease.
Get ready!
If you had a 3D controller, it also took advantage of the analog stick to provide smooth movement, reminiscent of the original arcade's flight stick. There isn't much else to say about this one. It was well received, though suffered a bit of the same sentiment as the 32X version. Most Saturn owners were more interested in ports of modern 3D arcade games, like Daytona and Virtua Fighter, than ports of older titles like Space Harrier. Nevertheless, it stands as an excellent port, and easily one of the best ways to play Space Harrier to this day. From here on out, things get a little tricky. Consoles were becoming powerful enough to replicate the arcade hardware, meaning ports started having very few differences between them. Space Harrier started popping up in compilations, in reasonable quality, though the emulation could occasionally produce dodgy results. It would also start becoming downloadable through online platforms like Nintendo's eShop. That said, there were a few curiosities that are worth mentioning. There were a few handheld adaptations over the years, from the already mentioned Game Gear version to some mobile phone ports. One of the more commonly known ones, though, is the Game Boy Advance port.
Get ready!
It was included in a neat little package of superscalar titles, and developed by Bit Studios. This sounds great on the surface, and there is something to be said for having decent conversions of these games on the handheld, but Space Harrier struggles a little. The port is fine, mostly accurate with a few minor changes and moments of weirdness. It suffers similarly to the Game Gear though, in that the small screen and nature of the hardware can make it difficult to enjoy as much as you should. Is it just me, or is Space Harrier not a game that's conducive to handheld gaming on the go? This last one is not a port as such, but instead a full-on 3D remake. Released for the PlayStation 2 in 2003, it took the concept of the original game and rebuilt it in a polygonal engine. It was not a straight remake either, with the gameplay being expanded upon to feel more like a hybrid of the original mixed with other games like Afterburner or Panzer Dragoon.
Get ready!
It was an interesting attempt, but there are issues. The visuals don't really evoke the art style of the original, with the colour palette and organic-looking enemies losing a lot of the magic. You have the choice to keep the landscapes as checkerboards or as more realistic surfaces, but neither look particularly interesting. The audio fares much better, with the voices expanding upon the cheesy lines of the original, and a really great remix of the theme pumping away in the background. It's not worthless, but I much prefer a port of the original over this remake personally. Space Harrier is an extremely important franchise in Sega's history. Despite there only being a few original titles, the franchise echoes throughout multiple eras of hardware and is even referenced in places you wouldn't expect.
Welcome to my fantasy zone.
It's also a great example of how a popular game on high-end hardware can force developers to get creative about how they interpret it during the conversion process. Some focused on getting the sprite detail and colour, whilst others chose speed at the expense of almost everything else. Each port provides a fascinating glimpse into the mind of their respective developers, and should all be appreciated in their own right.